Hello again, art history students. Welcome to another little video lecture. Today we're going to revisit Asia and the art of Asia, specifically India, China, and Japan. This lecture might get a little bit long, so we're just going to jump right into it. This is India, if you're not familiar with the geography of it. The main things that we're going to focus on when talking about India is iconography, and how that iconography is read in the two major religions, which is Hinduism and Buddhism. And then also we're going to touch a little bit on architecture and some of the things that we've seen before in architecture kind of how they're similar and how they're different in different parts of the world. So we're going to kind of not necessarily compare and contrast, but you'll see some things that are similar. So let's jump right into that. Hinduism. Hinduism is the main religion in India. It is the third largest religion in the world and is the only major religion that is polytheistic, right? That's a vocabulary word that you guys would have heard before. They have a pantheon of gods, and the importance of different gods ranges based on geography. Which kind of makes sense if you live in a mountainous region and there are gods associated with the mountains or deities associated with the sea and you live next to the sea, that kind of makes sense. So there is a massive variety. We are going to look at the two, I would consider them to be the two major deities of Hinduism, Shiva and Vishnu, and we're going to break apart some of the iconography associated with those two deities, and then also kind of some temples that are devoted to them. So let's migrate. All right, the first thing that we're going to look at is this image of Shiva as the Lord of the Dance, and we're going to kind of introduce quite a bit of information with this, which probably means there might be a test question about it, so peek your ears up. All right, so the first thing we notice is that Shiva is depicted in this circle of fire that goes all the way around. So Shiva's purpose, or one of the major aspects that Shiva represents, is the cycle of creation and destruction. And that's part of what that circle around there is. So in the Hindu tradition and in the Hindu religion, they believe in reincarnation. So this idea that your body dies or is destroyed and then your spirit is reborn in another body. So that's part of that cycle. And that cycle is both kind of individualized on like a you personal level and your spirit, all the way up to the universe. So the universe also has a cycle of creation and destruction. So that is part of what that circle represents. Shiva also holds a small fire here, and that represents the destruction of the ego. So if you think about it in the sense that there is this broader cycle that you're part of, you have to kind of release your individual ego and your self-importance, right? That's a big part of being part of that cycle. So if you have been reborn many times and will be reborn many more, or at least your spirit, this moment and like what you need and want is maybe not so important in this greater cycle that we see. So that's part of the iconography of the two kind of fires that we see. Next here there's a drum here in Shiva's hand, and that represents the beat which builds up towards the destruction. So there's kind of this rhythm or this time that drum is keeping. This hand, which is kind of like this outstretched palm out hand, represents have no fear. And then we see two kind of diagonal lines running across the body, with this arm that is stretched across the body and then this leg that is also stretched. And this hand points down to the foot. And that represents liberation. And it's very important that both of those limbs are kind of going across the body, right? It's a similar thing to what's happening with this fire in the hand. There's this liberation that takes place when you let go of the ego. So that's some of the iconography. The only other thing that we're going to talk about with this image is Shiva stands on top of a dwarf, and this represents becoming. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. Another thing that I want you guys to note with this is this depiction. This is obviously not the first depiction of Shiva as Lord of the Dance, and also there are many other depictions. This is just kind of like has the core of the iconography surrounding this deity. And then this is obviously not the first. It certainly is not the last. It's just kind of like a snapshot in time. So try to make note of that. There will probably be a question or two about this image, which is bronze, just to refresh that. And then we're going to go ahead and move on to the next major deity, which is Vishnu. So Vishnu and Shiva kind of have a little bit of like a relationship kind of thing. So if Shiva is the one who keeps time and keeps this cycle of creation and destruction, there's this switchover moment between when something is created and when something is destroyed, right? There's that kind of peak, but then there's all this time in between for the universe. And Vishnu's purpose is to maintain that the universe in that intermittent time in between when it is destroyed and created. So this is Vishnu dreaming of the cosmic waves, or Vishnu dreaming of the universe. Sorry, this artwork goes by a couple different names. So we're going to break down a couple things that we've seen before. And one is obvious hierarchical scale, right? So Vishnu is the largest character, right? We kind of see these cosmic waves kind of making this circular shape around the head, right? This idea that spirituality is kind of in the head is something that we've talked about over and over and over in this class. Another thing that we kind of see is there's characters being separated by architectural space. So these people kind of below this yellow line are a little bit closer to us, and then Vishnu is kind of in the sort of mid-ground or in the middle area, and then way up top are these kind of floating, more spiritual deities. So all of these characters that you see in this image are various deities within, or like smaller deities, I guess, because Vishnu and Shiva are kind of the two, they're like the main the main squeeze, and then there's obviously many lesser is not a good word, but minor deities. So those are the ones that we see there. Something else I want to point out is a new vocabulary word, which is gestalt. So we're going to go to the next slide. So this image has compositional unity, and then it also has conceptual unity. And we've seen this many times over in this class, but we've never introduced this word. So whenever something has both conceptual and compositional unity, and those things work together to communicate something to you, that is called gestalt. So let me break this down in a really simplified way, right? This is a V, right? But if I take 5 V's and put them in my drawing skills and kind of put them together in an arrangement, you see something else, right? Even though there's this, the only thing that's being represented there is this one shape, the V, you see something else when they're arranged like a star, right? So that is gestalt. That is these two things coming together to make something else. And they can't, if we removed one of those V's, it wouldn't make, you wouldn't see the star, even though it's not a completed shape. Right, so that's kind of gestalt in a nutshell. And we have seen this before, but I just haven't introduced the vocabulary word until this moment. So there's a pretty good chance that'll be on the test. All right, so this is the Great Temple at Tanjore. I Googled how to say that because I'm bad with vocabulary. So there's a couple things that we see. We see this major kind of tower shape that reaches our eyes up towards the heavens. So this temple is primarily devoted to Vishnu. And like we said, Vishnu is the maintainer of the universe in the intermittent time between the creation and destruction switchover, right? So let's look at the ground layout of this and kind of think about some things that we would have seen in the past. So if you remember way back to when we talked about the Latin cross plan during the Gothic era and a little bit of the medieval era that came before, there was this idea that churches or religious buildings, their layout and their construction somehow made a statement, right? It made this shape of a cross, which was the religious symbol for Christianity. Right? So the same kind of idea is being applied here. This, the Great Temple at Tanjore is laid out as a mini microcosm of the universe, right? So this is kind of the center, and then we see things kind of radiating out from there. And that makes sense because Vishnu is the maintainer of the universe in between that little switchover time. So we're kind of seeing some similarities in how architecture can be part of a greater idea, right? Which is kind of like Gestalt, right? All right, moving on, guys. This is a temple that is devoted to Shiva. So we see some things here. We see some of those same things. We see the kind of all these use of all these towers are kind of reaching our eye upward towards, again, the heavens or towards the sky. And then this entire building is covered, or this temple, I'm sorry, is covered with small kind of inset high relief sculptures. So let's take a deeper look at all of those. You can't really see, but you can kind of tell how many there would be just by looking at the exterior of this temple. Here is that information again for you and how it pulls the eye upward. This is some of the sculptures that are on the outside. There are more than 600. And one thing to note is that these are kind of a sensual or erotic joining of individuals, right? Which, when you put it in the religious context of Shiva specifically, it makes sense. So there is this creation and destruction that Shiva is that's their main purpose. Sorry, my phone is distracting me at the moment. So this kind of joining is what creates that new creation, right? So it's not, I wouldn't look at it as there's just like separations coming together to make something new, right? And that's kind of a religious thing or a religious ideal as part of that cycle that Shiva represents. All right, moving on. Opposing elements of the universe. All right, so this is a non-religious artwork from India. This is the Emperor Babu overseeing his gardens, right? So one thing I want you guys to kind of note is here there's this hand gesture, right? And it's gesturing towards this center. And there's all these individuals, these kind of people who are tending to this garden. Gardens are incredibly important all over the world. That's where our food comes from. All right, so this is not a religious artwork, but it does kind of have something that we might have remembered from a previous artwork. So those 4 sections of the garden that are running together represent the 4 cardinal directions. And then it's flowing towards us as the viewer, right? And then running down. And this image really has the symbolic use of water and the symbolic use of water trickling towards you as the viewer reminds me a lot of the Ghent altarpiece, right? How there was that little trickle of water that was kind of coming towards you at the very bottom of the image. If you remember back to when we talked about the Northern Renaissance. So water is both a conceptual and a visual focal point, which is again part of Gestalt. Water is the main building block of life. Without water, there is no life. So it makes sense to give that something that we very much so take for granted, or that we see as very basic, as kind of this elevation, right? They're visually bringing it together to conceptually elevate it. All right, moving on. Now we're going to talk about Buddhism. So in order to get into the storyline of Buddhism, first we have to say that Buddhism sprang out of Hinduism. And all this information that we're going to see here about the life stages of the Buddha, we're actually going to look at in the next slide and kind of break down the iconography. So this is a stela, which represents the life of the Buddha. So let's kind of have story time with Lacey a little bit. So this stela is read from the bottom up. So we're going to start down here, and what we see is we see the Buddha's mother, who was a queen. The Buddha is technically a prince. So she has a miraculous conception and a miraculous birth, or the Buddha does. So she dreamt that there was a white elephant that went into her womb, and then she awoke and she was pregnant. After the Buddha was born, she passed away almost immediately. So he was raised without his mother, and he was a prince, so he lived a very cloistered life, where he did not go out into the general population ever. He kind of grew up inside of the palace walls, was a good way to put that. And then also he wanted for nothing. And so anytime the Buddha was hungry, there were people to make him food. This was when he lived his life as a prince. Anytime he needed entertainment, there were people to play music or sing songs or whatever. If he needed company, whatever he needed, he automatically kind of received instantly. So this brings us to in his late 20s, him and a caravan of his attendants, right? So all the people who wait on him hand and foot are traveling from one palace to another palace. I think it's like a spring fall kind of transition. So they're traveling from this one place to the other, and somehow the caravan or the group that they're part of breaks down. And the Buddha is then walking with his favorite, like, teacher / best friend kind of individual. And they're walking along, and for the first time in the Buddha's life, he sees an old person. And he's like, what is going on with this? And his teacher friend describes aging and describes the fact that this will happen to everyone. And then they go along and they see a sick person. This is the first time the Buddha's ever seen a sick person, ever seen a person who, if I'm not mistaken, it is a crippled person, but don't quote me on that. And he's like, what's this all about? And again, it's explained to him for the first time that our bodies are kind of like fragile, and that they can get sick or they can get crippled. And again, the Buddha's mind is blown. So at this moment, he decides that life is fleeting, and that so this religion, again, springs out of Hinduism. So there is this idea of this cyclical nature of the soul, and that this life is fleeting, and thus it is not important. So we should focus on spiritual enlightenment. He then meditates underneath of a Bodhi tree and has his moment of enlightenment, which is what we see here in this kind of second section. This little area right here, this little kind of crescent shape, kind of bean shape, that's the top of the Bodhi tree that he's sitting under. And that's the moment when he really understands and has this moment of enlightenment. Then he goes on to give his first sermon, which is what we see up here. All right, so we see a couple things that are important. We see all of these smaller characters just sort of below or in front of the Buddha at this moment. And then we also see this wheel of life, which is around his head. I know it looks very similar to a halo, but it is technically called the wheel of life. But the same kind of thing applies, that this is the center of the spirituality in the body. So that is him giving his first sermon. And then up at the top is the moment when he achieves nirvana and tranquility. So it is read from the bottom up. There might be a test question about that. And it might be important for you guys to kind of know, maybe who the Buddha is in this. And then all of these other characters around here are other characters in the life of the Buddha and whatnot. But we're not going to get into all of that little individual iconography. What I want you guys to know is that kind of center section of this stela. Moving on. This is the Great Stupa. This is the burial chamber. It's basically a tomb, and this is what holds the body of the Buddha. This is the remains of the Buddha. This is a pilgrimage site for Buddhists, and it has these 4 kind of gateways around the outside. Ooh, you can't really see that color. Around the outside, and they are at the 4 cardinal directions. So again, this is a pilgrimage site, and we're going to kind of look at these gateways a little bit more in depth. All right, they're called toranas, I believe, or toranas. You guys know me. All right, so this represents the mandala, which is that recreation of the universe, right? That we saw. It's not the same religion, right? So when Buddhism sprang, it didn't necessarily dismiss all of the Hindu gods, but it was not focused on them. So there's still the same idea of reincarnation, right? And the recreation and destruction of both individual souls and how they have a cycle, and then also how the universe has a cycle. That is something that is in both religions, and it makes sense because this one came out of Hinduism. But it's not, it's similar but different. Let's leave it at that. All right, so let's look at these gateways. All right, so they again have some of the similar things that we've seen, right? Iconography of kind of the figures in a reproductive stage, right? Because that's very important to that cycle of creation, and then the moving on, the sort of evolution of the soul and whatnot. Then it's also covered, all of these gateways have various scenes from the life of the Buddha, and then also other kind of iconographical things that are representative. Elephants, and then lotus flowers. So lotus flowers are important in both Hinduism and in Buddhism, but for different reasons. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So this is the seated Buddha from the Gupta period. A couple things that we see here's that wheel of law that goes around the head, right? Very similar to a halo in the sort of drawing attention to the head as the spiritual center of the body. Specifically, the center of this wheel of law is right here at what's known as the third eye, right? So that's kind of like the center. If the wheel of law had a spoke and it spun around the head, that would kind of be the center point. That's important. We also see some of these same hand gestures that we would have seen before, and then these figures down here, which are separated by architecture, right? So that separates them in both time and in kind of space. All right. There is some of that information. All right, so next we're going to talk about Bodhisattva Padmapani, is how you pronounce that. So Bodhisattva is a title. Bodhisattva is not a name. This individual's name is Padmapani, and what he is a bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva is basically an individual who, rather than concerning themselves with their pursuit of nirvana or their pursuit of enlightenment, they guide others. So there's this slight amount of self-sacrifice to this. And that's one of the reasons why bodhisattvas are very highly regarded, is that they would forego their own enlightenment to help others. And we see the bodhisattva here holding a lotus flower. I know it's kind of difficult to see. So if you're not familiar with the lotus, it is a like a lily pad type plant that grows in swampy, a little bit of like mucky water. It has like a tuber at the bottom, which is actually edible. It's fried up and cooked in a whole bunch of different ways, and it grows in this like little bit of like just soggy water that on land that would not be used for anything else. I'll say it like that. It's too wet to grow anything. It's just a soggy marsh. And then from that tuber grows out these kind of wide lily pads, and then this incredibly beautiful yellow or pink, and I think also white flower grows out of that. So in the Buddhist tradition, this is very symbolic, that from this kind of all of this yuckiness that this life has, right? Where we could become crippled, or we could get sick, or all these kind of bad things that can happen in this life, which is kind of representative as this muckiness. There comes this lily pad which rises, right? That's enlightenment. And the nirvana is kind of the flower that blooms out of that. So there's this idea that from all of this bad will come good. So that's sort of the symbolic nature of the lotus flower in the Buddhist tradition. All right, so just remember this vocabulary word, bodhisattva, and that's like kind of helping others rather than pursuing their own nirvana. All right. The next, we're going to shift geographic location for just a moment, and we're going to go down here to Cambodia, which is right next to Vietnam, if you are not familiar. And this area of the world, both Hinduism and Buddhism have kind of spread and migrated. We're going to talk about how Buddhism migrates into China and then also into Japan ultimately, and takes very strong root in Japan and has a little bit of influence on their art. But Cambodia, there's only one thing that we're going to look at in this area, which is Angkor Wat. So Angkor Wat is the largest religious site in the world. And we have looked at a lot of religious architecture in this class. Remember when we looked at all of the pilgrimage sites for Islam, and we looked at all those Christian pilgrimage sites and all those Gothic cathedrals and all those kinds of things, even way back to Stonehenge when we talked about that. This is the largest in the world. It was originally constructed as a Hindu temple, and then when Buddhism, I don't want to say took over, but kind of became the primary religion of the area, it switched, but it still depicts a whole lot of Hindu bas reliefs all over the walls, right? There's a lot of Hindu imagery, and there's no like this building is now used for this and no longer for this, so we have to cover that up or anything like that. It's just sort of like an acceptance. And another interesting thing is they believe that this building was built on the foundation of a previous religion that would have been native or indigenous to Cambodia. So this area has been a religious center since forever, as far as we know. So this would have been a massive undertaking, right? We see some things that we would have seen before, right? There's these kind of pillar things, these towers that draw our eyes up towards the heavens, just like we would have seen in the Hindu temples that we saw. And then they're kind of have the same or similar architectural elements on the outside of them, of like figures and people that you would know who they are from the iconography of the place. And then those pillars or those towers represent lotus flowers. This whole complex is surrounded by a moat, which is not a moat for any sort of defensive strategy or anything of that nature. This moat represents the ocean, right? Which is part of that layout of the building as a kind of microcosm of the universe, just like we would have seen in that temple, the great temple at Tanjore, which would have been devoted to Vishnu specifically. So let's look at some of the bas relief. All right, that's a word that you should remember. Right, there's that idea of the lotus flowers and the ocean. All right, so this is a bas relief that goes along like a very long hallway or kind of like corridor going around the outside of one of those main levels in the building. I've not been there. I would love to go there, but I do know that this image stretches both directions for an enormous amount of space. There's a couple YouTube videos if you're interested in it. So what we see here is the center. So this is Vishnu. Let's get a different color. This is Vishnu in the center. All right. And on this side, we see a bunch of characters who are holding on to what looks like a rope, but it is actually a snake god or a deity that is in the form of a snake. And then on the other side, we see demons who are on the other end of this snake deity, and they are having a tug of war. And in this moment of this tug of war, there is this sort of cosmic thing that's happening, and this moment kind of creates creates life, is basically the rough storyline. But another thing I want to note specifically from the art historical standpoint is Vishnu is the main character. He's the most important character, thus he's the largest. And then these little kind of dancing people in the background, I think they look awesome with their little, their kind of little arms and legs. They're cheering on their minor deities, right? We've seen there's definitely a hierarchy of deities in the Hindu tradition, sorry. And these are kind of minor characters which are cheering on the good guys and the bad guys as they're involved in this tug of war. And then, like I said, this imagery that you just see a little hint of here with these kind of four good guys and then these demons and good guys on either side, it just stretches and expands in both directions in Angkor So, all right, there's information on that. It might be worth noting for, test question that it's a bas relief. That's a vocabulary word that we would have learned a long time ago. All right, next we're going to move up to China and we're going to talk about scroll painting. So let's move to the next slide first. All right, linked below this video will be a link for this quick YouTube video. I personally would like you to pause at this moment and then watch that video and then come back to this video. But you are obviously a free individual and can do it however you want, but that would be my preference. If we were in class together, we would take a moment and watch that video and then continue with the lecture. So please do that now. All right, so in that little video, you saw him unscroll or unravel that scroll. And one of the reasons why I want you to see that and watch that little video is not so much about he talks about how there's these people of the royal courts and how they're together at this moment and stuff. That's not necessarily what I wanted you to take away from that video. What I wanted you to take away is that very individualized experience of using that object, how he unfurled it and then opened it and then had those like blocks of wood kind of thing that he used to open it at a certain section. So it's a very individualized experience to look at these Chinese scrolls, right? This is just a small section of this larger band or banner up here is the entirety of scenes along the Shaoxing River as these two rivers kind of come together. I think right here is the point where they kind of merge into one. So that's what we're seeing in this very long scroll, but you can't take it in at once. Like you would have to have, you know, a considerably long table, and then would have to curl up certain areas of it as you went to expand the next area. So it's a very involved process in looking at these. And also you have a lot of agency as the viewer. You have agency over how long you look at a certain section, how fast you go, how much. If you're an individual with maybe a really long arm span, you're seeing more of the image at one time than if you're someone who maybe doesn't have such a large arm span, that sort of thing. It's very, very individualized. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we look at some of these other scrolls. So scrolls can both be horizontal and vertical, right? So this is a vertical scroll. It has a lot of the same things where we have these kind of three distances, as they're called. It's kind of the foreground, middle ground, and then the background, which is much more distant, and you kind of experience them from the bottom up, usually when they're a vertical scroll. So this is the one that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. And this is Ge Jinwan moving his dwelling. So this image kind of represents something important in the Taoist tradition, which is one of the indigenous religions to China. Sorry, I had to pause. All right. So here at the bottom, right, we said we kind of read these from the bottom up. We see this little traveler. This is Jinzhuan, is how you pronounce his name for sure. I did my research on that. I'm terrible at pronunciations. So he is moving his dwelling, and he has this choice of all of this space up in front of him, and he has to find his way. That is what Taoism is sometimes referred to as the way. So as you, as the viewer, look at this, you see him and you know that he is moving his dwelling up into this upper area. And your eyes may travel like this, right? You may kind of go up the image like that, or your eyes may go straight up like this. Right? So there's this very individualized way in which you see this image, and it's different than how I see it. And that's one of the main principles of Taoism, is that everyone has a way, everyone has a journey that they have to seek and find, right? And that journey leads them to their own happiness and prosperity. So if you're someone who, you know, your way, your personal journey should take you on this route, but you fight that and you try to go do something else with your life, or you try to be someone else, you're unhappy and you're not following the way, and thus you're not sort of living your life like you're supposed to. You're maybe following a script that someone else wrote for you as far as what you should be doing with your life, or whatever the case may be. If you're out of sync with your journey, you're unhappy. And that's just one of the major kind of pillars of Taoism. And I think it's very well represented in an artwork like this. It almost makes explaining the idea so easy. The fact that you see this in one way and I see it in another. And it's very different than some of what we've seen in the Western tradition. Like, we saw that image of Judith decapitating Holofernes many times. And if you remember Artizma Gillespie's version, it was like everything in the painting focused your eyes on that one focal point, right? Everything drew your attention to that focal point. And that's what you were supposed to take away from it. And this artwork's very different. There is no clear focal point, which allows your eyes to kind of wander around. So very different approaches for very different reasons, but just no clear focal point intentionally. All right. So another thing that to note is that you cannot view the entire scroll at once, right? Just like you cannot plan or know your entire journey at once. I think you guys are sort of in a younger life stage. It's a very bad idea to plan the next 25 years of your life at this moment. Give yourself a 3 to 5 year plan as my personal kind of, make a plan, but don't think that you're gonna know what's gonna happen in 15 years, because you're not. All right, so moving on. All right, so now we're going to talk about Japan. Japan is the last place that we're going to talk about. Like I said, this one's getting a little bit long, but there's a lot of information here. So Buddhism migrates into Japan and has a really strong influence. The native or indigenous religion to Japan is Shintoism. And Shintoism is this belief that everything has its own kami, and kami is spirit. So every person has a spirit, every tree, every mountain, every babbling brook in the woods, the ocean itself has a very large kami. Obviously, it's a very massive spirit. And then even your individual house and chairs and turnips all have kami, right? That's part of the idea. And then when Buddhism kind of makes its way to Japan, it's very influential. So we're going to break that down a little bit. First things first is this artwork, which we saw way back at the beginning of class. And this is the 6 views of Mount Fuji, or it's a print from that series. And one of the things that we talked about is this kind of the menacing angriness of these waves, right? It's not a clear photorealistic depiction of waves. It's intentionally showing that potential danger of the kami of the ocean spirit, right? The ocean kami has power. It has power to break your little boats that you're out fishing in here. We can see some of these guys kind of fishing, and it is a very massive, powerful kami. Also is Mount Fuji, which we see here in the background. So it also has the kind of 3 distances, or really it's mostly like foreground and distant background. So moving on, okay? This artwork directly relates or directly has kind of it's very reminiscent of this yin-yang symbol. And the yin-yang symbol is originally developed or originally created in China, but it is very important in the Shinto tradition or the Shinto religion, right? And it's kind of there's this balance, right? And that's what we kind of see with this wave. Think about it. If the ocean would provide so much food and resources, Japan is an island nation, but yet also so much danger. So there's kind of this balance that's happening between what we receive from this kami and also kind of it gives and takes, right? So that's kind of the representation that we see there. All right, and then there's again some of that kind of. All right, next we're going to talk about the Japanese tea ceremony. So this is called Chayu, which is the way of tea, and this is a religious, or it's like a disciplined religious type thing. It is from the Zen Buddhist tradition, which is very much so a merge of Buddhism, right, as we would have seen it in India, as we just talked about it, but also kind of the take on it like from the Shinto perspective, right? So let's get right into this tea ceremony. So I said that this is kind of a religious experience to go to the tea house. And we've talked a lot in our discussions about architecture, about how architecture can affect you, right? Even from the very beginning of this class, when we talked about how those buildings that command authority, like courthouses and stuff, they have those vertical pillars out in front of them because that creates a sense of stability and authority within us as the viewer, and how going into a building with big giant doors kind of makes you feel a different way, right? So there's these psychological responses that certain buildings are trying to get from you. And the tea house is no different, but it's very different in what it's trying to communicate to you or the psychological response it's trying to get. So this is a small tea house made by one of the most famous tea masters in Japan. And an important thing to note is this is the view looking from the door in. So this is the entirety of the tea house. And the door is not like a traditional sized door. It's very small. So you have to actually kind of crouch down. You have to physically change your shape to get into the building and then come back up. And that creates this psychological response where you've left everything outside and your time in this space is different, right? There's no ability for someone to like bust in through the doors, right? Like swinging both of them open or something like that. That's not something that's going to happen in this space. The other thing is there'd usually be only 3 or 4 people in this building at any given time. 4 might be very crowded. There's this little area on the floor here, right? So this little area has a little place to make a little fire and boil water for tea. And then the tea would be served and it would be quiet conversation and contemplation. There are no big iconographical images coming at you, reminding you of stories or traditions from any given government or any given faith or anything like that. It's very much so there's just this little scroll here on the one side, and then usually there would be a flower arrangement. And when I say flower arrangement, if you're familiar with the term ikebana, that is the Japanese flower arrangement. And it's not like a big bouquet of roses. It's like some things that would be in season at the time in the local area around the tea house. Sometimes it's just grasses and maybe a twig branch or something. It's meant to kind of, again, be a moment of contemplation or a visual cue for contemplation. It's not meant to make this bold statement like a bouquet of roses is. So let's talk now about the tea bowl and the actual tea ceremony. Yep, so minimal decoration for sure. All right, so this is the tea bowl, which is called Mount Fuji. So a couple things to note about it is this color, or what you could almost argue could be like discoloration, this darker at the bottom and then lighter at the top is part of the firing process. It's not like this is covered in soot or something like that. It's part of the firing process. This would have been fired in a wood kiln. So the tea bowl is very simple, but it's very visually has a lot going on. And the wood firing process is a process where the artist kind of loses quite a bit of control. The flame is what puts the decoration on, and thus that kind of is reflective of some of the ideas in the Japanese tea ceremony and in Zen Buddhism, right? There is this kind of loss of control of exactly what this is going to look like. The artist does not have that control, but they do have control over this rim. And as you hold this object, just so you know, They kind of fit in your hand just perfectly like this. You could, as you look and hold the chaiwan, which is what the tea bowl is called, there's kind of this little landscape on the rim, and you get to see that and kind of contemplate that. It's very different than an industrial made cup, which has a very flat, smooth top, right? Most of us have cups like this in our home, and they're, that's important. It makes, drinking out of it is very smooth and easy, and you can drink from any sort of area or section. This bowl, you have to actually kind of think about where you're going to put your lips. And that's part of the entire experience of coming into this place and this quiet moment of reflection, this quiet moment of the only decisions that you're making in there, what you're going to talk about with the person, what you think of these very minimal ikebana flower arrangements and very, very minimal decoration, and where you're going to put your lips on this cup, right? It's a very leaving everything outside. So, all right, moving on and kind of exploring a little bit more of Zen Buddhism. Yep. All right, next we're going to talk about ukiyo. And ukiyo are Japanese woodblock prints. So you've been in class with me now for a year, and one thing that you can definitely know, or not a year, a semester, and one thing you can definitely note about that I talk about when I talk about prints is printmaking's ability to be widely distributed and to be widely accessed by more people. And that's because they're inexpensive and they're often mass produced. There is only one Ghent altarpiece, right? There's only one object like that. So it can only be seen by so many people in any given time frame. Whereas prints, when there's so many of them made, they're widely distributed and seen by so many more people. So in the Zen Buddhist tradition, there is this reverence or appreciation for daily life, right? You can see that with their kind of the cup and where you're going to put the lip on the cup, right? That's taking appreciation for something that we all take for granted all day long, every day, is taking a drink of water or tea. So ukiyo are called pictures of the floating world. So let's look at the first one that we're going to see. So this is titled The Jewel River at Ide, and this is a moment of daily life. These are some young women. I'm going to assume that they're maybe after school or something like that, and they have come to the river just on a hot day to wait around and put their feet in the water. And this is a moment from daily life, but it is a really good moment. If you were walking home or anywhere on a hot day with friends and you came across a little brook and everybody took their shoes off and splashed around for a couple minutes and then continued on your way to wherever you were coming or going from, that would be a good memory, right? Just that little tiny moments. That's what we kind of see here, is taking pleasure in those little moments of togetherness, of cooling off on hot days and stuff like that always feels good. And again, these are prints, so they are widely distributed. This is another, this is called View from the, I'm not going to try to pronounce all this because I'm going to get it wrong. But basically, this is another view from another tea house. Now, don't get it confused with the Zen Buddhist tea house. This tea house is more like a Starbucks, like where people go to get tea and socialize, and it's not a religious type experience. The idea is not that you go there for several hours and contemplate. This is sort of like, oh, I'm hungry, I need a sandwich and a cup of tea, like a Starbucks, which is still a nice experience. But one thing I want you to note is this image is very flat, right? So we have a foreground here, right? Everybody kind of to this side of this line could be considered the foreground. They're closest to us. And then this kind of middle ground, and then all the way back to this background, which is way off in the distant mountain, right? But even though we see the three distances, foreground, middle ground, background, it's still very flat. They're still very kind of flush to each other, we only understand the distance because of how they're arranged, right? There's very little value difference. This, like these ladies here who we see talking and stuff, they don't cast shadows. We don't know where is the sun, right? Everyone's kind of illuminated and whatnot, but there's not that interest in making a very clear and concise three-dimensional photorealistic image. This is kind of a memory of a moment, right, is what's kind of being communicated here. So keep that idea of the flatness in mind as we move forward. All right, the main artist that we're going to talk about in regard to ukiyo prints is Utamaro, Kitagawa Utamaro. And he is by far the most famous ukiyo printmaker. And he created worked in the tradition called I'm not going to pronounce it very well. It's like Bijingna or Beijing. Anyway, it's images of beautiful women, right? In the Zen Buddhist tradition, and in, a little bit in the Hindu tradition, which is kind of where the roots of this come from, there's this idea that this life is fleeting. This life does not last forever. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at two courtesans, which are two beautiful women. This lady kind of in the background, right? She's helping the other one fix her hair. And this lady in the foreground is reading music. This lady has a musical instrument, kind of like a guitar type instrument. And they're getting ready for the day, right? So they're in their beautiful clothes. And they're both geishas, which are basically women of the brothel. So let's move to the next slide. Benjgana, I think is how that's pronounced. Anyway, it's images of beautiful women, specifically beautiful women from the geisha tradition, which is a courtesan tradition, which is a prostitute tradition, but it is not seen in the same way that we see prostitutes in the West. These women are incredibly well educated, incredibly well informed, incredibly well paid. This is a kind of a different perspective on something, and I just want you to keep an open mind to that as we talk about this moving forward. So, and also keep this image in mind because it will come back. These images will eventually move to Europe and America. These prints, right? Because prints can go all over the place and be so widely distributed. They eventually make their way to Europe and America and are very influential in kind of the way they use space and whatnot. So we will see this image again and we'll digest it more then. So this is another Utamaro print. This is a triptych. It's 3 sections. I know it might be kind of difficult to tell the difference, but it's actually 3 individual wood blocks. And it shows the morning after a night at the brothel party. So at these brothels where these geishas are, every night is kind of a festive night of men and women meeting each other. And like I said, these women are highly educated and they're very well informed about things. Part of what their job is and part of what they do is discuss things like current events. People who are coming might be politicians or something, so they might have to be able to be versed a little bit in the social structure or in government a little bit, things like that. I mean, the same kind of thing if you wanted to be a really well-paid lady of the night in New York or in Washington, D.C., you might want to know who's who and that kind of stuff. So it's the same kind of general principle. They all would have played music or wrote poetry or sang, right? Because they're a part of what their job is entertainment. And this would have been something. So next I want to talk about who is the audience for this. And the audience is obviously men of maybe a middle class who could maybe afford to go to the geishas maybe only once or twice a year, right? So it would be a big moment of kind of celebration or something to go, and you don't get to go all the time, right? It would be expensive to go all the time. So the people who are buying these are men of middle class or something. They get the chance to own this memory, right? And it would be a memory that they would more than likely have or share in, just like we saw those images of those girls splashing around in the river, which, you know, on a hot day, more than likely you all have a fond memory of something kind of similar, even if not exactly the same, right? So there's kind of this bringing back the memory that you already have. So Udamaro made a lot of money making prints like this, right? This one is Lovers in an upstairs room, right? So he would have made a lot of money, but one thing that's kind of interesting is the women who were the subject matters would not have made a significant amount of money. And it's also important to note, which I think we talked about when we talked about Vincent van Gogh, is that usually artists don't make a ton of money in their lifetime. It's usually after they pass away that that's when the real money comes in. So one thing that is interesting about this, as far as the money goes and as far as the economy goes, is the main time that you would really want to be there. I think this is kind of strange. So there's this festive thing that happens every evening, you know, starts in the evening time and, you know, parties into the night and whatnot. And then people eventually retire for the day. And then the next day, this doesn't happen. So this is a nighttime job or an evening to nighttime job. So, but the people who had the most money would pay to stay after the actual place closed down. And that was called the Dragon Hour. So here we see two entertainers kind of laying down for the evening. This is probably actually very early in the morning is when these women are actually laying down to go to bed. And then here's two other people doing the paperwork books for the evening. If you've ever worked at a restaurant or anything like that, you know that this is not an interesting time to be there. Everyone's just doing paperwork and calculations and then leaving and cleaning up for the night. But this was the time when really wealthy people could pay to be there. And Udamaro was able to pay and stay during this time frame and actually make art about it. So it's kind of like the money that he made helped perpetuate more economy as far as this goes. So it's kind of an interesting way in which art and economy are related to each other, which we've kind of said prosperity and economy and art are not separate from each other. As much as we would like to think that they are in the world, there rarely ever are. So, like I said, this video has gotten really long. So if you have any questions, please email me. Please watch that little video that's linked beneath this. Pause in the middle and do that. So if you have any questions, send me an email. I hope you all are happy and healthy. Thank you.